He thought his money gave him the right to crush anyone. When the entitled rich kid slammed the young waitress's face into the diner table just because she spilled a drop of sauce, he laughed, thinking he was untouchable. He was wrong. Suddenly, the door flew open and the room went ice cold. A Navy SEAL and his 90-pound German Shepherd stepped inside. The bully had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and the justice about to be served would change this town forever. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The sun hung directly overhead like a polished brass coin, unrelenting and fierce, baking the asphalt of Port Haven until the air itself seemed to shimmer in a haze of heat distortion. It was high noon in this coastal Oregon town, but the usual cool Pacific breeze had seemingly abandoned the streets, leaving behind a heavy, humid stillness that clung to skin and clothes alike. The town smelled of low tide, drying kelp, and the faint, acrid scent of diesel fumes from the fishing trawlers bobbing lazily in the harbor. It was the kind of weather that made movement slow and tempers short, where the shadows were stark and black against the bleached white of the concrete. In the center of this sweltering tableau stood the Harbor Light, a diner that had weathered decades of storms and economic shifts. Its windows were plastered with flyers for local crab festivals and high school football games, and the open sign buzzed with a neon determination against the overpowering daylight. Inside, the diner was a hum of activity, packed with dock workers seeking refuge in the air conditioning, retired fishermen nursing bottomless cups of coffee, and families trying to escape the midday glare. The structure itself looked tired but resilient, much like the people who frequented it, with siding that had been scrubbed by salt winds and a roof that had seen better days. In the far corner of the diner's gravel and asphalt parking lot, seeking the only sanctuary the exterior world offered, a massive black pickup truck sat idling with a low, rhythmic rumble beneath the sprawling, knobby branches of an ancient oak tree. The truck was covered in a layer of travel dust, evidence of a long journey across state lines, but the engine purred with the precision of a well-maintained machine. Standing by the open passenger door was Zion Scott. He was a man who seemed to occupy more space than his physical dimensions should allow, standing 6'4" with broad shoulders that strained against the fabric of his simple gray T-shirt. Zion was a Navy SEAL currently on leave, and even in this relaxed setting, he carried himself with a coiled, dormant power. His skin was bronzed from years of exposure to the elements, and his hair was cropped close in a functional military style. His face was a map of hard-earned experience, with a square jaw and eyes the color of dark flint that scanned the perimeter with habitual, unconscious vigilance. He was not a man who fidgeted. His movements were economical and precise. Currently, those movements were dedicated to pouring bottled water into a collapsible bowl for his companion. Titan, a magnificent German Shepherd with a coat of midnight black and burnished tan, lapped at the water with focused intensity. The dog was large for his breed, with a thick chest and intelligent amber eyes that mirrored his master's alertness. Titan was not merely a pet, but a working animal, trained to operate in high-stress environments, yet here in the Iawam shade of the oak, he displayed a calm discipline, ignoring a stray cat that darted under a nearby fence. Zion watched the dog drink, his hand resting briefly on the animal's muscular neck, offering a silent communication of bond and reassurance. They had been driving for hours, heading north to visit family, and this stop in Port Haven was meant to be a brief interlude for coffee and a stretch. Zion reached into the bed of the truck to adjust a strap on his duffel bag, ensuring everything was secure. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his size, the heat of the day barely seeming to register on him, as if he had endured environments far more hostile than a sunny Oregon afternoon. The lazy, heavy atmosphere of the parking lot was suddenly shattered, not by the cry of a seagull or the horn of a boat, but by the aggressive, throaty roar of a high-performance engine. Zion didn't flinch, but his head turned slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as a cherry-red convertible sports car tore around the corner and pulled into the lot with unnecessary speed. The car was an alien object in this setting, a gleaming symbol of excess amidst the rusted sedans and dented work trucks of the locals. It looked like a drop of fresh blood on a faded canvas. The driver revved the engine once more, a boastful growl that echoed off the diner's walls, before killing the ignition. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Preston Vance III. He was a young man in his mid-20s who wore his wealth like a suit of armor. He was dressed in a cream-colored linen suit that was impeccably tailored but entirely impractical for the dusty coastal town. His blond hair was slicked back with enough product to withstand a hurricane, and his face, soft and unlined, was set in a permanent expression of boredom and entitlement. Preston adjusted his expensive sunglasses and looked around the parking lot with a sneer, as if the very air of Port Haven was offensive to his lungs. He walked around to the passenger side, not to open the door for his companion, but to inspect his own car for dust specks. The passenger door swung open, and Serena Sterling emerged. She was a striking woman, though her beauty was hardened by an air of severe superiority. She wore a pristine white summer dress that looked as though it had never seen a wrinkled moment, and her accessories, a designer handbag and oversized sunglasses, screamed of high-end boutiques in the city. Her dark hair was styled in loose, perfect waves, and she immediately raised a hand to shield her face from the sun, grimacing as the humidity hit her. Zion, standing in the shadows of the oak tree some 50 feet away, watched them with a detached curiosity. He saw the way Preston snapped his fingers at Serena to hurry up, and the way Serena audibly sighed, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her shoulder. They were a stark contrast to the weary, hard-working people Zion had seen entering the diner earlier. "It's suffocating out here," Serena complained, her voice carrying across the lot with a shrill, piercing quality. "I told you we should have stopped at the country club in the last town. This place looks like it hasn't passed a health inspection since the 90s. Preston laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Relax, babe. We just need a quick bite. Besides, my father is looking at buying up this block. I want to see if it's worth bulldozing or if we should just burn it down for the insurance money." He kicked at a loose piece of gravel with his Italian leather loafer, looking at the diner with predatory amusement. "Come on, let's see if they know what sparkling water is, or if they just serve tap water and disappointment." Titan lifted his head, his ears perking up as he tracked the couple's movement. A low, almost inaudible rumble started in the dog's throat, not quite a growl, but a vibration of warning. Zion placed a calming hand on Titan's head, silencing him instantly. "Steady," Zion whispered, his voice a low baritone. He didn't like them. He didn't like the way the man walked with his chest puffed out, scanning for people to intimidate, nor the way the woman looked at the world as if it existed solely to serve her. But Zion was a disciplined man. He was not the police, and he was not a bouncer. He was just a traveler passing through. As long as they kept their arrogance to themselves, he would stay in the shade. He watched as Preston and Serena approached the entrance of the Harbor Light. Preston pushed the door open with his shoulder, not bothering to hold it for an elderly man who was just coming out, forcing the old-timer to shuffle quickly out of the way to avoid being hit. Serena followed, her nose wrinkled, as if she could smell the frying grease from outside. The door swung shut behind them, swallowing the bright red and white of their outfits into the dim interior of the diner. Zion remained by his truck, the heat waves rising from the asphalt distorting the air around the diner's entrance. He picked up his water bottle and took a long drink, his eyes still fixed on the door. He had an instinct about trouble. He could smell it on the wind, like ozone before a thunderstorm. And those two who had just walked in carried a storm cloud with them. He capped his water bottle and looked down at Titan. "Let's give them a minute, buddy," Zion said softly. "Then we'll go get that coffee." He wasn't in a rush to share space with them, but the road ahead was long, and he needed the caffeine. Zion leaned back against the warm metal of his truck, crossing his arms over his chest, deciding to wait in the sweltering heat a little longer, unaware that the quiet atmosphere of the diner was about to be shattered and that his peaceful leave was about to take a violent detour. The interior of the Harbor Light offered a sharp sensory contrast to the oppressive, blinding heat of the parking lot, though it had its own heavy atmosphere. The air conditioner hummed with a rattling, desperate rhythm, circulating air that smelled of frying bacon, strong coffee, and the faint sweet scent of maple syrup. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the blinds, illuminating the worn linoleum floor and the vinyl booths that had cracked with age and use. For the regulars, this place was a sanctuary, a familiar living room where the coffee was endless and the gossip flowed freely. Navigating this ecosystem was Josie Adams, a 22-year-old waitress who moved with a practiced, weary efficiency. Josie was petite, with strawberry blonde hair pulled back into a messy, utilitarian bun that couldn't quite contain the wisps curling around her face due to the humidity. Her uniform, a pale blue dress with a white apron, was clean but frayed at the hems, a testament to how long she had been making it last. There were dark circles under her hazel eyes, shadows cast by double shifts, and sleepless nights spent worrying about the mounting pile of medical bills on her kitchen counter for her grandmother's heart medication. Despite her exhaustion, Josie possessed a natural warmth, offering a tired but genuine smile to old Mr. Henderson as she refilled his mug for the third time, asking about his grandchildren with sincere interest. The peaceful, rhythmic clatter of silverware and low murmurs of conversation were abruptly severed when the front door swung open, admitting a blast of hot air and the two new arrivals. Preston Vance III and Serena Sterling did not wait to be seated. They swept past the "Please wait to be seated" sign with the confidence of people who owned every room they entered, claiming a large booth near the window that had just been vacated by a family of 4. Josie, balancing a heavy tray loaded with the fisherman's special, platters of fried cod, coleslaw, and fries, took a deep breath and adjusted her course. She knew the type. Port Haven didn't get many tourists in Italian suits and designer dresses, but when they did appear, they usually treated the locals like part of the scenery. As she approached their table, she could already hear Serena's voice, sharp and complaining, cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated knife. "The table is sticky, Preston. My elbows are actually sticking to the wood. It's disgusting." Preston, busy inspecting his reflection in the back of a spoon, waved a dismissive hand. "Just try not to touch anything, babe. We'll eat, buy the block, and leave." Josie approached the table, her arms trembling slightly under the weight of the tray she was carrying for a neighboring table. She forced a polite smile, intending to drop off the food at the adjacent booth before taking their order. "I'll be right with you folks," she said softly, her voice raspy, from hours of talking. As she moved past their booth, the narrow aisle between the tables became a treacherous pass. Preston, looking bored and malicious, stretched his long legs out into the walkway, his expensive loafer hooking perfectly around Josie's ankle. It wasn't an accident. The smirk on his face as he watched her approach confirmed the intent. He was bored, and in his world, other people were merely playthings to alleviate his ennui. Josie's foot caught the obstruction solid. She gasped, lurching forward, her balance completely compromised. She tried to correct herself, to save the tray, but gravity was unforgiving. The tray tipped. A ramekin filled with bright red marinara sauce launched itself from the edge of the platter, sailing through the air in a perfect, horrifying arc before landing squarely in the lap of Serena's pristine white summer dress. The impact was wet and final. The red stain bloomed instantly on the white fabric, looking shocking and violent in the sunlit diner. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The entire diner seemed to inhale at once. Then Serena screamed. It was a high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek of pure rage that made several patrons jump in their seats. "You stupid, clumsy little idiot!" Serena roared, leaping to her feet, the sauce dripping onto the floor. Josie, who had managed to catch herself on the edge of the table to avoid falling completely, was horrified. Her face went pale, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Josie stammered, grabbing a handful of napkins from her apron. "I didn't mean to. I tripped. Let me help you." She reached out instinctively to dab at the stain, a gesture of pure panic and helpfulness. "Don't touch me," Serena shrieked, and then, with a speed fueled by entitlement and fury, she swung her hand. The slap echoed through the diner like a gunshot. It was a vicious, open-handed strike that connected hard with Josie's cheek, snapping her head to the side. The force of the blow sent Josie stumbling back, clutching her stinging face, tears of shock instantly welling in her eyes. The diner erupted in gasps. Old Mr. Henderson started to struggle out of his booth, his face red with indignation, but his arthritic knees were slow. "Hey!" someone shouted from the counter, but before anyone could intervene, Preston was moving. He didn't move to calm his girlfriend or apologize. Instead, he saw an opportunity to perform, to assert dominance in front of these locals. He stood up, his face twisted into a mask of ugly aggression. "You ruined her dress," he snarled, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. He stepped forward, closing the distance between him and the terrified waitress. "Do you have any idea how much that cost? It's worth more than your entire life." He reached out, his hand tangling violently into Josie's strawberry blonde hair. Josie cried out in pain as he yanked her head forward. With a brutal shove, Preston forced her upper body down, slamming her face against the hard, varnish-sticky wood of the table. The impact rattled the silverware and sent the sugar dispenser skittering across the surface. He didn't let go. He held her head pinned there, his fingers tightening in her hair, his other hand pressing down on her shoulder to keep her immobilized. "You are going to apologize," Preston hissed, leaning down so his mouth was close to her ear, his breath hot and smelling of mints. "And then you're going to get on your knees and clean it up. Look at what you did. Look at it," Josie sobbed, her cheek pressed against the table, helpless and terrified, her hands scrabbling uselessly at the edge of the wood. The cruelty was absolute, a public execution of her dignity. The patrons were frozen in a mix of horror and disbelief. The violence had escalated so quickly that their minds were struggling to catch up. A few of the men were rising now, anger replacing the shock, but they were old, and Preston was young and fit. At that precise moment of supreme injustice, just as Preston applied more pressure to the weeping girl's neck, the bell above the entrance door chimed. It was a cheerful, welcoming sound that jarred terribly with the scene inside. The heavy door swung inward, opening all the way. The blinding white light of the high noon sun flooded into the entryway, temporarily dazzling everyone looking in that direction. But then the light was eclipsed. A massive silhouette stepped into the frame, blocking out the sun, casting a long, imposing shadow that stretched across the linoleum floor all the way to Preston's feet. It was a wall of a man, broad and still, and beside him the distinct, sharp-eared outline of a large beast. The figure didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, radiating a terrifying calmness that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the room. The air conditioner rattled on, but for everyone in the harbor light, the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. The shadow had arrived, and it was looking directly at Preston Vance III. The silence that descended upon the Harbor Light Diner was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant rattle of the air conditioner. It was as if the world itself had held its breath in anticipation of violence. Zion Scott stepped fully into the room, the door closing slowly behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss that sounded like a final warning. He did not shout. He did not run. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size, his boots making no sound on the worn linoleum. To the frozen patrons, he appeared less like a man and more like a force of nature that had just blown in from the coast, dark and inevitable. Beside him, Titan moved in perfect synchronization. The German shepherd did not bark, Barking was for warning, and the time for warnings had passed the moment Preston Vance III laid hands on the young waitress. Titan lowered his head, his ears pinned back against his skull, transforming from a loyal companion into a precision instrument of intimidation. The dog's amber eyes locked onto Preston's exposed leg, and a low, rumbling vibration began in his chest, a sound so deep it was felt in the floorboards rather than heard. Preston, still bent over the table with his hand tangled in Josie's hair, was the last to realize the atmosphere had shifted. He was too intoxicated by the rush of his own petty power, too focused on the sobbing girl beneath his grip. "Did you hear me?" Preston sneered at the back of Josie's head, oblivious to the shadow falling over him. "I said apologize." But the words died in his throat as a sudden primal chill ran up his spine. It was the instinct of a prey animal sensing a predator. He started to turn his head, annoyed at the interruption, expecting perhaps a manager or another elderly local he could verbally dismantle. Instead, he found himself staring into the black, wet nose of a 90-pound German shepherd. Titan was mere inches from him, lips curled back just enough to reveal gleaming white fangs that promised catastrophic damage. The growl escalated, a jagged tear in the silence, causing Preston to freeze, his muscles locking up in pure, unadulterated terror. Before Preston could process the threat of the dog, a hand clamped onto his shoulder. It wasn't a grab, it was a clamp, feeling less like flesh and bone and more like industrial machinery. Zion stood directly behind him, his face a mask of stone. There was no anger in Zion's eyes, which was infinitely more terrifying than rage. There was only a cold, calculated assessment, the look of a man who had dismantled insurgents in war zones and was now looking at a nuisance. Zion's fingers found the sensitive cluster of nerves between Preston's neck and shoulder, a pressure point known intimately to those trained in neutralizing threats without leaving permanent marks. He didn't squeeze, he simply applied directed, devastating pressure. The yes-Jaws effect was instantaneous. An electric shock of agony shot down Preston's arm, bypassing his conscious thought and triggering a biological override. His hand, which had been gripping Josie's hair, sprang open involuntarily as his knees buckled. Preston let out a strangled yelp, a high-pitched sound of shock that embarrassed him even as it left his lips. "Let her go," Zion said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a resonance that vibrated in the chest of everyone in the room. It was a command, not a request. He increased the pressure on the nerve cluster by a fraction of an inch, forcing Preston to twist away from the table, away from Josie, and down toward the floor. The young heir to the Vance fortune, who moments ago had been posturing like a king, was now contorted in pain, dancing on his tiptoes to alleviate the agony radiating from his shoulder. "I'm letting go! I'm letting go! You're breaking my shoulder!" Preston shrieked, his face draining of color, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. Zion guided him backward with effortless control, moving him away from the victim as one might remove an unruly child, though with significantly more threat of violence. He released the pressure only when Preston was clear of the booth, shoving him lightly so he stumbled back against the counter, clutching his arm and gasping for air. Titan stepped forward, placing himself between Preston and the booth, a living barrier of muscle and teeth. Across the table, Serena Sterling reacted with the instincts of her generation. Seeing her boyfriend neutralized and humiliated, she didn't rush to help him. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag and fumbled for her smartphone, her weapon of choice. She whipped it out, her thumb hovering over the record button, her face twisting into a mask of indignant victimhood. "I am recording this!" she screeched, her voice trembling but shrill. "You just assaulted him. I'm going to ruin you. Do you know who we are? The internet is going to see this, and you'll be in jail before sunset." She raised the phone, aiming the camera lens at Zion's face, ready to frame the narrative, ready to turn the soldier into the villain. Zion turned his head slowly to look at her. He didn't lunge for the phone. He didn't speak. He simply directed the full weight of his gaze upon her. It was the 1,000-yard stare, a look born from witnessing things that Serena could not even nightmare about. It was a look that stripped away the facade of civilization and polite society, revealing the raw, dangerous reality beneath. In that gaze, Serena saw something that terrified her more than any threat. She saw a man who did not care about her money, her followers, or her social standing. She saw a man who could end her existence in seconds and sleep soundly afterwards. The sheer, overwhelming intensity of his presence crashed against her fragile arrogance. Her hand began to shake, first slightly, then violently. The bravado evaporated, leaving behind a cold void of fear. Her fingers lost their sensation, and the sleek, expensive smartphone slipped from her grasp. It hit the linoleum floor with a loud, pathetic clatter, sliding under the table. Serena didn't move to retrieve it. She shrank back against the vinyl booth, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, pinned by the gray, flinty eyes of the stranger. With the threats neutralized, the tension in Zion's frame dissipated instantly, replaced by a gentle urgency. He turned his back on the cowering couple, dismissing them as if they were no longer relevant, and looked down at Josie. The young waitress was still slumped over the table, trembling, her hands covering her face, small sobs racking her thin shoulders. The red marinara stain on Serena's dress was forgotten. The humiliation and the physical pain of her hair being pulled were the only things real to her in that moment. Zion reached out, his large hand, the same hand that had just crippled Preston with a touch, hovering for a second to ensure he wouldn't startle her before gently touching her shoulder. "It's over," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming soft and rumbling, like distant thunder. "You're safe now, ma'am." Josie looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and wide with shock. She saw the mountain of a man standing over her, blocking the harsh sun, creating a cool shadow of safety. She saw the concern etched into his rugged features, a stark contrast to the cruelty she had just endured. Zion reached over to the napkin dispenser, pulled out a handful of paper napkins, and offered them to her. It was a small, mundane gesture, but in the context of the violence, it felt incredibly kind. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her face for bruises. Josie took the napkins with shaking fingers, wiping the tears from her cheeks. She shook her head mutely, unable to form words, but the gratitude in her eyes spoke volumes. Zion offered her a hand. She hesitated, then placed her small, calloused hand in his. He pulled her up effortlessly, stabilizing her when she swayed on unsteady legs. Turning back to the room, Zion looked at Preston and Serena. Preston was massaging his shoulder, his eyes darting between Zion and the door, looking for an escape, but too prideful to run immediately. Serena was clutching her purse, staring at her ruined dress and the floor where her phone lay. "Get out," Zion said. The command was simple. It wasn't shouted. It was spoken with the finality of a judge passing a sentence. "Pay for your meal, leave a tip, and get out, before I decide that you're a threat to the safety of this establishment." You can't tell us what to do," Preston stammered, though he was already backing toward the door, his survival instinct overriding his ego. Titan took a single step forward and let out a sharp, percussive bark, just one, that sounded like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Preston jumped nearly a foot in the air. "We're leaving! We're leaving!" he yelled, throwing a wad of cash onto the counter without counting it. He didn't wait for Serena. He scrambled for the door, pushing it open and stumbling out into the blinding heat. Serena, realizing she was alone with the monster and his beast, snatched up her phone and scrambled after him, her heels clicking frantically on the floor. The door swung shut, and for a moment the diner was silent again. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the patrons let out a collective breath. Old Mr. Henderson clapped his hands once, a sharp sound of approval, and suddenly the diner was filled with murmurs of awe and relief. Zion didn't acknowledge the applause. He just looked at Josie, his expression softening. "You okay?" he asked again, ignoring the hero worship building around him, focused solely on the civilian he had sworn to protect. The relief inside the harbor light was short-lived, a fragile bubble of calm that popped the moment the distant wail of a siren sliced through the humid afternoon air. It started as a low drone, indistinguishable from the wind, but quickly escalated into a piercing, rhythmic shriek that grew louder with every second. Zion Scott, who had been quietly helping Josie pick up the spilled silverware, straightened up. He knew that sound intimately. It was the sound of authority arriving, but in a town like this, authority often arrived with complications. He looked at Josie, whose face had gone pale again. "Stay here," he told her, his voice calm and reassuring. "Don't come out until I say it's okay." He signaled to Titan with a subtle hand gesture, a command to heel, and turned toward the door. He wasn't going to let the confrontation happen inside, amongst the glass and the innocent bystanders. He pushed the door open and stepped back out into the oppressive heat of the day, just as a dusty sheriff's cruiser skidded into the parking lot, its lights flashing red and blue against the bright sunlight. The cruiser came to a halt at a crooked angle, blocking the exit for Zion's truck. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped Sheriff Barnaby Miller. Miller was a man in his late 50s who looked as though he had been fighting a losing battle with gravity and cholesterol for decades. He was heavy-set, his tan uniform straining against a protruding stomach that hung over a gun belt equipped with more tactical gear than a small-town sheriff would ever need. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy red, slick with sweat that dripped from beneath his Stetson hat. He had the look of a man who enjoyed the power of his badge, but resented the physical effort required to enforce it. He adjusted his belt, which seemed to be digging into his hips, and marched toward the diner entrance, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of his holstered sidearm. Preston Vance III, who had been pacing angrily by his red convertible, saw his salvation arrive. He immediately transformed. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a performance of exaggerated victimhood that would have been impressive if it weren't so pathetic. He limped forward, though his legs had not been injured, clutching his shoulder as if it were hanging by a thread. "Sheriff! Sheriff! Thank God you're here!" Preston yelled, his voice cracking with feigned emotion. "He's a maniac. He attacked me. I was just sitting there having lunch with my girlfriend, and this drifter came out of nowhere and assaulted me. Look at my shoulder. I think it's dislocated." Serena, taking her cue, rushed to his side, adding her own shrill commentary. "He has a vicious dog, Sheriff. It tried to bite Preston's face off. He's dangerous. He threatened to kill us." Miller stopped, his eyes darting from the weeping millionaire to the towering figure of Zion standing calmly by the diner door. He didn't ask questions. He didn't assess the scene. He saw a Vance, the son of the most powerful man in the county, claiming assault, and he saw a stranger who looked like trouble. Miller's face hardened into a scowl. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at Zion. "You! Hands where I can see them! Now!" Miller shouted, his voice rough and authoritative. "Step away from the animal and get down on your knees." Zion didn't move. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands clearly visible but relaxed at his sides. He didn't kneel. He didn't flinch. He simply watched Miller with a detached, professional assessment. "I'm not going to do that, Sheriff," Zion said, his tone even and respectful, but firm. "There was an altercation, but I didn't attack anyone. I intervened to stop an assault on a waitress." "I didn't ask for your life story, boy. I gave you a direct order," Miller bellowed, his face turning a darker shade of purple. He unclipped the retention strap on his holster. "I said get down, and control that beast before I call animal control to put a bullet in it. We don't tolerate dangerous animals in Port Haven." At the mention of a threat to Titan, a dangerous glint appeared in Zion's eyes, though his body remained motionless. Titan, sensing the hostility, let out a low rumble, stepping slightly in front of Zion, ready to engage. "The dog is under control, Sheriff," Zion warned, his voice dropping a few decibels. "I suggest you lower your voice. You're escalating a situation that is already resolved." The door of the diner opened behind Zion, and a group of patrons spilled out, led by Mr. Henderson. The elderly fisherman, leaning on his cane, pointed a trembling finger at Preston. "That's a lie, Miller, a damn lie," the old man shouted, his voice thin but fierce. "That rich punk was hurting Josie. He was smashing her face into the table. This man just stopped him. He's a hero." Other voices joined in, a chorus of gray-haired locals defending the stranger. "Don't listen to the Vances, Miller. The boy is lying. Leave the man alone." Miller faltered for a second, looking at the crowd of voters yelling at him. But then he looked at Preston Vance, whose father practically funded the sheriff's re-election campaign. The choice was made. "Quiet!" Miller roared at the crowd. "Back inside, all of you, or I'll write you all up for obstructing justice and disturbing the peace. This is a crime scene, not a town hall meeting." He turned back to Zion, emboldened by his own shouting. "Last warning, on the ground. Now." Zion sighed, a short exhale through his nose. He realized that logic wasn't going to work with a man like Miller. He needed a different kind of authority. "I am going to reach into my back pocket for my wallet, Sheriff," Zion announced slowly, broadcasting his movements to ensure he wasn't shot by the jittery officer. "I am going to show you my identification, and then we are going to have a very different conversation." Miller hesitated, his hand still hovering near his gun. "Slowly," Miller hissed. "One wrong move, and I drop you." Zion moved with deliberate slowness. He reached back, retrieved a slim black leather wallet, and flipped it open. He didn't pull out a driver's license. He pulled out a common access card, CAC, with a specific color coding and a secondary laminated card behind it that bore the seal of the Department of the Navy and a specific warfare insignia. Zion took 2 steps forward, ignoring Miller's flinch, and held the ID up into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. "Read it," Zion commanded. The command wasn't shouted, but it had the weight of federal authority behind it. Miller squinted against the glare, leaning in to look at the card. He saw the rank. He saw the unit designation, Naval Special Warfare Group. He saw the clearance level. The color drained from Miller's face faster than water from a cracked bucket. The sweat on his forehead suddenly felt cold. He wasn't looking at a drifter. He was looking at a high-ranking Tier 1 operator, a Navy SEAL who was likely technically government property. Arresting him wouldn't just be a paperwork headache. It would bring a storm of federal oversight, lawyers, and commanding officers down on Miller's small-time department. The dynamic shifted instantly. The bully and Miller evaporated, leaving behind a terrified bureaucrat. Miller stammered, taking a step back, his hand flying away from his gun as if it were hot. He looked at Zion, really looked at him this time, and saw the lethal competence he had missed before. I wasn't aware of your status, sir." Zion tucked the wallet back into his pocket. "Now you are," Zion said coldly. "Mr. Vance assaulted a civilian inside that establishment. I have multiple witnesses. I suggest you take a report from them, and I suggest you tell Mr. Vance to leave before I decide to file a formal complaint about your conduct and his." Miller swallowed hard. He looked at Preston, who was still waiting for Zion to be cuffed. "Sheriff, what are you doing? Arrest him!" Preston screamed. Miller turned to the rich kid, his patience snapping under the pressure of his near-fatal mistake. "Shut up, Preston," Miller snapped. "Get in your car. Go home. Now." Preston's jaw dropped. "What? My father will hear about this." "Tell your father whatever you want," Miller hissed, lowering his voice so only Preston could hear. "But get out of here before you get us both in federal prison. Move!" The air in the executive office of Preston Vance II was filtered, chilled, and scented with expensive leather and old money, a stark contrast to the humid, salty reality of the town below. Vance II, the patriarch of the family and the puppet master of Port Haven's economy, stood by a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the harbor he intended to gentrify. He was a man in his late 50s, his silver hair styled with severe precision, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most local fishermen earned in a year. His eyes, a pale, icy blue, lacked the heat of his son's temper, but held a far more dangerous, calculating coldness. He held his phone to his ear, listening to the frantic, exaggerated recounting of the diner incident from Preston III. The son whined about a maniac and a wolf. The father heard only incompetence and a threat to the family image. "Enough, Preston," Vance II said, his voice smooth and devoid of empathy. "You let a drifter humiliate you in public. Stop crying. I will handle it." He ended the call without a goodbye. He didn't care about the soldier. He cared about leverage. He dialed a new number, his finger tapping the mahogany desk with impatience. The recipient was Mr. Gantry, a nervous, sweating man who owned the rundown rental properties on the edge of town. "Gantry," Vance II said, cutting off the landlord's greeting. "That girl, the waitress, Adams. She rents the cottage on Elm. I want her out. Today. Find a clause, fabricate a violation, I don't care. Just put her on the street." He hung up, satisfied that the problem was being crushed, not with a fist, but with a signature. Back at the harbor light, the adrenaline was fading, replaced by a weary reality. Zion Scott had insisted on paying for everyone's meal, a gesture that earned him quiet nods of respect from the regulars, but his focus remained on Josie. She was in the back, splashing cold water on her face, trying to compose herself. When she emerged, she looked fragile, her spirit bruised, but not broken. However, as she reached for her apron, her pocket buzzed. She pulled out her cracked smartphone, and as she listened to the voice on the other end, Zion watched the color drain from her face completely. She didn't cry this time. She just looked hollowed out. "I understand," she whispered into the phone, her voice trembling. "But today? I have nowhere—" "Yes, I understand." She lowered the phone, looking at Zion with eyes that had lost all hope. "My landlord," she said, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes. "He says there were complaints about noise, about hygiene. He's evicting us. He says I have to be out by sunset, or the sheriff will come back." Zion didn't need to be a detective to connect the dots. The timeline was too tight, the cruelty too specific. "Get your things," Zion said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm driving you home." The drive to the outskirts of Port Haven was quiet. Titan sat in the back seat of the pickup, his head resting on the console, occasionally nudging Josie's elbow with a wet nose as if sensing her distress. Josie gave Zion directions, guiding him away from the harbor and into a neighborhood where the pavement cracked and the grass grew wild. They pulled up to a small, weathered cottage that looked like it was holding itself together through sheer force of will. The paint, once a cheerful yellow, was peeling in long strips, and the front porch sagged noticeably to the left. But there were flower boxes filled with bright marigolds, and the windows were sparkling clean. It was a home that was loved, even if it was falling apart. Zion parked the truck, and before he could open his door, he saw movement on the porch. An elderly woman sat in a worn, manual wheelchair, a hand-knitted shawl draped over her shoulders despite the heat. This was Martha, Josie's grandmother. Her hair was a cloud of snowy white, and her face was a map of deep wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and clear, possessing the same hazel warmth as her granddaughter's. She watched the strange truck pull up with guarded curiosity. Zion stepped out, followed by Titan. He signaled the dog to stay close. Josie hurried up the walk, trying to hide her distress. "Grandma, it's okay, we have a guest," she lied poorly. Martha looked from Josie's red-rimmed eyes to the giant man walking up her path. "Guest?" Martha asked, her voice raspy but strong. "He looks more like a tank that learned to walk, and he brought a bear with him?" Zion smiled, a genuine expression that softened the hard planes of his face. "Zion Scott, ma'am," he said, removing his sunglasses. "And this is Titan. We had a little trouble in town. Thought I'd make sure Josie got home safe." Zion didn't leave. He couldn't fix the eviction notice, not yet, but he could fix the immediate brokenness he saw in front of him. He saw the way the front gate hung off its hinges, a symbol of the vulnerability of the two women living there. He saw the rotting step on the porch that threatened to trap a wheelchair wheel. "I've got some tools in the truck," Zion announced, rolling up the sleeves of his gray T-shirt, revealing thick, corded muscles. "And I've got a few hours before I need to be anywhere." Josie tried to protest, overwhelmed by the kindness of a stranger, but Martha silenced her with a look. "Let the man work, Josie," Martha said softly. "A man needs to do something with his hands when he's angry at the world, and I think Mr. Scott is very angry at the world right now." Martha was more perceptive than she looked. The next 2 hours transformed the gloomy atmosphere of the cottage into something resembling hope. The late afternoon sun, now a rich golden honey color, bathed the front yard in a warm glow. Zion moved with the rhythmic efficiency of a man who treated labor as a form of meditation. He went to his truck, retrieved a heavy toolbox and a stash of spare lumber he kept for emergencies. The sound of a hammer striking nails echoed through the quiet street, a steady, reassuring percussion. He rehung the gate, reinforcing the hinges with long screws so it swung smooth and true. He replaced the rotted boards on the porch steps, testing his full weight on them to ensure they would hold. Sweat glistened on his forehead and soaked the back of his shirt, but he didn't slow down. He was channeling his frustration with the Vance family, driving it into the wood with every strike of the hammer. On the porch, Martha sat in her wheelchair, a glass of iced tea in her hand, watching him. Titan had claimed a spot at the bottom of the newly fixed stairs, lying in a patch of sunlight. The great dog was perfectly still, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes were open, scanning the street. He was on guard duty. At one point, a squirrel darted across the lawn, and Titan's ears perked up, but a quiet word from Martha made him settle back down. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" she cooed. Titan thumped his tail once against the ground, acknowledging the praise. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the violence of the diner and the cold sterility of Vance II's office. Here there was no money, but there was dignity. Josie came out with a glass of water for Zion. She stood by the railing, watching him wipe the sawdust from his hands. The sunlight caught the sweat on his arms, making him look like a statue cast in bronze. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. We might not even be here tomorrow to use it." Zion took the glass, draining it in one long swallow. He looked at the sturdy gate, then at the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows. "You'll be here," Zion said, his voice low and certain. "A lease is a contract. Eviction takes 30 days by state law, minimum. He's bluffing to scare you. And he just picked a fight with someone who doesn't scare easily." He handed the glass back to her, his fingers brushing hers. "I'm not leaving town tonight, Josie, not until this is fixed properly." He looked over at Titan, then up at Martha, who gave him a small, knowing nod. In that golden light, amidst the smell of fresh sawdust and blooming marigolds, the soldier wasn't just a protector. He was a builder, restoring the boundaries that the rich and powerful had tried to tear down. The sun began its descent into the Pacific, transforming the sky over Port Haven from a brilliant blue to a bruised canvas of violent oranges, deep purples, and blood-red streaks. The heat of the day lingered in the asphalt, radiating upward in shimmering waves, but the shadows were growing longer, stretching like dark fingers across the industrial district near the docks. Zion Scott had driven his truck down to the terrified silence of the old shipping yards, seeking a specific type of treated lumber for Martha's porch that the local hardware store didn't stock. The area was a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers, stacked 3 high like the building blocks of giants, creating narrow canyons of steel and gloom. The air here tasted different. It was metallic, heavy with the scent of diesel fuel, stagnant seawater, and the decaying wood of the old piers. It was a place where business was done after hours and where eyes watched from the dark recesses of warehouses. Zion finished loading the last heavy beam into the bed of his truck, securing it with a ratchet strap. He wiped the sweat from his brow with his forearm, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Despite the solitude, his senses were on high alert. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a primal warning system honed by years of surviving in hostile territories. He wasn't alone. Titan, who had been sitting dutifully in the cab with the window rolled down, let out a sound that was less of a growl and more of a low, vibrating hum of warning. The dog's ears swiveled toward the stack of red containers to their left. Zion didn't look immediately. He casually walked to the driver's side door as if checking his side mirror, using the reflection to scan the perimeter. Movement. Shadows detaching themselves from the darkness. There were 5 of them. They emerged from the gaps between the containers, spreading out in a fan formation designed to cut off his escape route. They weren't casual muggers. They moved with a coordination that suggested they had been paid to be professional, though their discipline was loose and arrogant. Leading the pack was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and bad decisions. He was known on the streets as Brock, a former dock worker turned enforcer for whoever paid the most. Brock stood over 6 feet tall, with a shaved head and a thick, jagged scar running from his ear to his chin. He wore a heavy denim vest over a black hoodie, despite the heat, and his hands were wrapped in leather tape, the knuckles studded with metal. The men behind him were smaller but armed with lengths of pipe, baseball bats, and heavy chains that clinked softly as they walked. Zion turned slowly to face them, leaning casually against the bed of his truck. He crossed his arms, looking completely at ease, which seemed to confuse the approaching group. They were used to fear, to panic, to victims begging for mercy. Zion looked at them the way a mechanic looks at a broken engine, a problem to be solved, nothing more. "You boys lost?" Zion asked, his voice calm and leveled, cutting through the quiet evening air. Brock stopped 10 feet away, spitting a glob of tobacco onto the gravel. He grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Not lost, soldier boy," Brock rasped, his voice sounding like gravel in a blender. "Just trash collection. Mr. Vance sends his regards. He says you need to learn a lesson about respecting your betters." Brock cracked his knuckles, the sound loud in the stillness. "The order is simple. We break your legs so you can't walk out of town." "And the dog?" He pointed a thick finger at the cab where Titan was now barking ferociously. "The dog comes with us. The boss wants a new rug." The mention of Titan changed the equation instantly. The calm calculation in Zion's eyes hardened into something glacial. He reached through the open window and unlatched the door. "Titan," Zion commanded softly. "Cover." The black German shepherd exploded from the truck, landing on the gravel with a snarl that echoed off the steel walls. But he didn't charge blindly. He moved to Zion's left flank, his body low to the ground, teeth bared, waiting for the signal. "Last chance to walk away," Zion said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't want to do this." Brock laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Get him!" he roared, signaling his men to attack. It was a mistake. The fight that followed was not a brawl. It was a dismantling. The first attacker, a lanky man with a baseball bat, swung wild and high, aiming for Zion's head. Zion didn't retreat. He stepped into the swing, closing the distance instantly. His left forearm blocked the attacker's wrist, stopping the momentum dead, while his right palm drove hard into the man's solar plexus. The air left the attacker's lungs in a wheezing whoosh, and he crumpled to the ground. In the same motion, Zion spun, using the falling man as a shield against the second attacker who was wielding a chain. The chain lashed out, wrapping harmlessly around the first man's legs. Zion grabbed the chain, yanked it violently, and pulled the second man off balance, sending him face first into the gravel. Titan was a black streak of fury. A thug with a lead pipe tried to circle around to Zion's blind side. Titan intercepted him, launching his 90-pound frame into the man's chest. The man went down screaming as Titan pinned him, jaws snapping inches from his throat, terrifying him into absolute submission without drawing a drop of blood. The dog was a master of psychological warfare, holding the threat of violence so close that the man froze, dropping his weapon and covering his face. Brock, seeing his crew dismantled in under 10 seconds, roared in frustration and charged. He was a brawler, relying on brute strength and weight. He threw a heavy, looping right hook aimed at Zion's jaw. Zion didn't block it. He slipped under it. Moving, With the fluid precision of water, Zion pivoted behind Brock, grabbed the back of his denim vest and his belt, and used Brock's own forward momentum against him. With a sharp exhale, Zion heaved. Brock's feet left the ground. The large man sailed through the air and crashed hard into the side of a red shipping container with a deafening metallic boom. He slid down the steel wall. Dazed, the wind knocked out of him. Before Brock could recover, Zion was on him. He didn't strike. He controlled. Zion twisted Brock's arm behind his back, applying pressure to the shoulder joint until Brock cried out in agony, his face pressed into the gravel. "Stay down," Zion commanded, his knee pressing firmly into Brock's spine. The other attackers, seeing their leader defeated so easily, scrambled backward. One looked at Titan, who was standing over their fallen comrade with a low growl, and decided that fleeing was the only option. They dropped their weapons and ran, their footsteps crunching frantically on the gravel as they disappeared into the maze of containers. Zion didn't pursue. He had what he needed. He reached into Brock's back pocket and pulled out a cracked smartphone. "Let's see who signed your paycheck," Zion muttered. He grabbed Brock's thumb and forcibly pressed it against the sensor to unlock the screen. The screen glowed bright in the dimming light. Zion navigated to the messages. There it was, a text thread from a contact labeled Vance Jr. The most recent message, sent 20 minutes ago, read, "Make sure he can't walk. Bring the dog to the Marina warehouse. Dad wants this done before the charity gala tomorrow. No mistakes." Zion took a picture of the screen with his own phone, securing the evidence. He stood up, releasing Brock. The big man groaned, clutching his shoulder, too broken to fight back. "Tell Vance," Zion said, looking down at him with contempt, "that he just made a tactical error. He didn't hire a hit squad. He just delivered the evidence I needed." Zion whistled. "Titan, heel." The dog immediately left the terrified thug he was pinning and trotted to Zion's side, his tail wagging slightly, as if they had just finished a game of fetch. Zion turned his back on the groaning man and walked back to his truck. The sun had fully set now, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows across the docks. Zion climbed into the cab, his heart rate barely elevated. He looked at the phone in his hand, the glowing text message, a digital smoking gun. This wasn't just about a bully in a diner anymore. It was a conspiracy involving the most powerful family in town. He started the engine, the headlights cutting through the gloom. As he drove away from the docks, leaving the defeated mercenaries in the dust, Zion knew the next battle wouldn't be fought with fists. It would be fought in the light of day, and he was ready to bring the storm to their doorstep. The morning sun over Port Haven was no longer the oppressive, baking heat of the previous day. Instead, it was a crisp, radiant gold that illuminated the manicured lawns of the Vance estate with a picturesque perfection. The estate, a sprawling mansion perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, was the crown jewel of the county, a fortress of white stone and wrought iron. Today, the expansive grounds had been transformed into a stage for the annual Port Haven Community Gala, an event that was ostensibly about charity, but was, in reality, a pageant of wealth and influence. White marquees dotted the green grass, waiters in tuxedos navigated through the crowd with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and a string quartet played Vivaldi in the shade of a gazebo. At the center of this social whirlwind was Preston Vance II. He moved through the crowd of local politicians, business partners, and socialites with the ease of a monarch, his shark-like smile fixed in place. Beside him stood Preston III, his arm in a black silk sling that was entirely unnecessary but added a dramatic flair to his story of being attacked by a vagrant. Serena Sterling was there too, wearing a new dress, recounting the trauma of the previous day to a circle of sympathetic women who clutched their pearls in horror. The atmosphere was one of self-congratulatory excess. Vance II took the stage, a raised platform adorned with flowers and a massive LED screen that was cycling through images of the family's previous charitable donations. He tapped the microphone, the feedback drawing immediate silence from the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vance II began, his voice smooth and practiced, "we gather here not just to celebrate our success, but to protect our community. Yesterday, my son was brutally assaulted by a dangerous drifter. It reminds us that we must be vigilant to keep Port Haven safe and civilized." The crowd murmured in agreement, casting glances of pity toward Preston III. "But let us not dwell on the darkness," Vance II continued, raising a glass. "Let us focus on the future we are building." It was at that precise moment that the heavy iron gates at the bottom of the drive swung open. They didn't open for a guest's luxury sedan. They opened to admit a black government SUV with tinted windows, flanked by two marked state police cruisers. The convoy moved slowly, ominously up the long driveway, the crunch of gravel under tires cutting through the classical music. The string quartet faltered and stopped. The conversation died. All eyes turned to the vehicles as they came to a halt at the edge of the lawn. The doors of the SUV opened. First out was a man who needed no introduction to the crowd, though his appearance had changed drastically. Zion Scott stepped onto the grass, but the gray T-shirt and dust of the road were gone. In their place, he wore the pristine, blindingly white, dress-white uniform of a United States Navy Chief Petty Officer. The high collar, the gold buttons, and the rows of colorful ribbons on his chest caught the sunlight, creating an aura of unimpeachable authority. On his left breast, the metallic trident of the SEALs gleamed like a warning. At his side, Titan sat at perfect attention, wearing a tactical service vest that marked him as a working military dog. Stepping out from the other side of the vehicle was a man who provided a sharp contrast to Zion's military splendor. Special Agent Elias Thorne was a man in his 40s with a receding hairline and wire-rimmed glasses that hid eyes as sharp as scalpels. He wore a charcoal suit that was ill-fitting in a way that suggested he was too busy catching criminals to visit a tailor. He carried a leather briefcase and walked with a shuffling, unassuming gait that made people underestimate him until it was too late. Behind them, 4 uniformed state troopers emerged from the cruisers, their hats pulled low, their hands resting near their belts. Zion didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight toward the stage, his path cutting through the crowd like an icebreaker through a frozen sea. The guests, realizing that this was not part of the entertainment, parted quickly, whispering furiously. Preston Vance II stood on the stage, his smile faltering for the first time. "Security!" he barked into the microphone, his composure cracking. "Remove these trespassers!" Sheriff Miller, who had been enjoying the buffet near the stage, scrambled forward, wiping crumbs from his mouth. He looked flushed and panicked, reaching for his radio. "You!" Miller shouted, waddling toward Zion. "I told you to get out of town. You're trespassing on private property. I'm placing you under arrest." Special Agent Thorne stepped in front of Miller, blocking his path with a surprising speed. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held up a badge that identified him as a federal agent of the FBI. "Sit down, Sheriff," Thorne said, his voice dry and bored. "You are currently a subject of a federal corruption investigation. If you touch your radio or your weapon, these state troopers will tackle you. And they aren't gentle." Miller froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. The color drained from his face as 2 troopers moved in, flanking him and relieving him of his sidearm. Zion continued to the stage. He climbed the stairs, the wood thumping under his polished shoes. Preston III shrank back behind his father, the fake sling trembling. "Get away from me!" Preston III squealed. "He's going to kill us!" Zion ignored the son and looked directly at the father. Vance II tried to muster his arrogance. "Do you know who I am? I will have you court-martialed. I will have you buried." Zion reached out and calmly took the microphone from Vance's hand. The sound of his breathing filled the speakers. "My name is Chief Petty Officer Zion Scott," Zion announced, his voice booming across the lawn, reaching every stunned guest, and the local news crew that Vance had hired to cover the event. "And I am not here to disrupt your party. I am here to present the truth." He nodded to Thorne, who had moved to the control table for the AV system. The FBI agent plugged a flash drive into the laptop. The LED screen behind the stage flickered, and the images of Charity vanished. In their place, grainy but clear security footage from the harbor light appeared. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. On the massive screen, everyone saw Preston Vance III, not a victim, but a predator. They saw him trip Josie. They saw Serena slap her. They saw Preston grab the waitress by the hair and slam her face into the table. There was no audio, but the violence was undeniable. Then the screen changed. It displayed a screenshot of a text message thread. The sender was clearly identified as Vance Jr. and the recipient as Brock. The text was magnified. Make sure he can't walk. Bring the dog to the Marina warehouse. Dad wants this done before the charity gala tomorrow. No mistakes. The silence on the lawn was total. It was the silence of a facade shattering. The wealthy elites of Port Haven looked from the screen to the man they had been toasting, horror and disgust dawning on their faces. Zion turned to Preston II. "You didn't just bully a waitress," Zion said, his voice cold and hard. "You ordered a hit on a Federal Service member. You conspired to kidnap a military working dog, and you used your local sheriff to cover it up." Vance II looked around, seeing his empire crumbling in real time. He saw the judgment in the eyes of his peers, the camera lenses pointed at him, and the state troopers marching up the stairs. "This is fake!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "It's a deep fake! It's a conspiracy!" But nobody was listening. Special Agent Thorne stepped onto the stage. "Preston Vance II, Preston Vance III," Thorne intoned, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit assault, bribery of a public official, and multiple counts of racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." As the troopers handcuffed the father and son, the scene was chaotic. Preston III was sobbing loudly, begging his father to fix it. Vance II was shouting threats at his lawyers. Serena Sterling tried to sneak away into the crowd, but a female trooper blocked her path, asking for a statement regarding the assault in the diner. Below the stage, Sheriff Miller was having his badge unpinned from his chest by the state police captain. He looked small and defeated, the power he had abused for years stripped away in seconds. Zion stood at the edge of the stage, Titan sitting regally beside him. He watched the arrests with a stoic expression. He didn't smile. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a necessary sanitation. He looked out at the crowd, who were still staring at him in awe. He caught the eye of the cameraman and gave a curt nod. The message had been sent. The Vances were not untouchable. The shadows they had used to control the town had been burned away by the light of truth, delivered by a man in white. 7 days had passed since the storm of justice swept through Port Haven, and the town had undergone a transformation that felt nothing short of miraculous. The oppressive, stagnant atmosphere that had hung over the streets like a fog had lifted, blown away by the fresh, clean breeze rolling in off the Pacific. It was early morning, the kind of crystal-clear coastal morning where the sky is a limitless expanse of robin's egg blue, and the sunlight feels like a warm embrace rather than a hammer blow. At the Harbor Light Diner, the open sign was flipped on, but it was hardly necessary. The parking lot was already full, not with flashy sports cars, but with the rusted, reliable pickups of fishermen, the sedans of teachers, and the bicycles of kids on summer break. Inside, the diner was vibrating with energy. It wasn't the hushed, fearful quiet of before, nor the tense murmur of gossip. It was the loud, boisterous sound of a community reclaiming its space. The smell of frying bacon and brewing coffee wafted out onto the street, acting as a beacon. Josie Adams moved through this chaos with a new kind of grace. She was no longer the hunched, terrified girl trying to make herself invisible. She wore her uniform with her shoulders back and her head held high. Her strawberry blonde hair was still pulled back, but the dark circles under her eyes had vanished, replaced by a brightness that matched the morning sun. Customers didn't just order food, they greeted her by name, asked about her grandmother, and left tips that were far larger than the bill required. There was a protective air around her now. The regulars, led by Mr. Henderson, had formed an unofficial guard, ensuring that everyone who walked through the door treated the staff with respect. The diner had become a symbol of their victory, a place where the ordinary people of Port Haven celebrated the fact that they were no longer under the boot of the Vance family. Even the air conditioner seemed to be working better, humming a steady, contented rhythm, as if it too felt the relief of the town. Miles away from the bustle of the diner, at the small cottage on Elm Street, a different kind of work was reaching its conclusion. Zion Scott stood by the newly repaired fence, wiping his hands on a rag. Over the last week, the dilapidated property had been transformed. The sagging porch was now level and sturdy, the rotting wood replaced with strong, treated lumber that smelled of pine and resilience. The peeling yellow paint had been scraped away and replaced with a fresh, clean coat of white that gleamed in the morning light. The gate, once hanging by a thread, now swung smoothly on heavy-duty hinges, latching with a satisfying click. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a fortress of dignity. Zion surveyed his work with the critical eye of a craftsman, checking for any missed spots or loose screws. Finding none, he nodded to himself. His mission here was complete. Titan was lying on the lush green grass of the front yard, chewing contentedly on a new rubber toy that Martha had bought him. The German shepherd looked relaxed, his ears flopping slightly as he enjoyed the peace. He had spent the week patrolling the yard, but the threats had vanished. The black SUVs of the Vance security detail were gone, replaced by the occasional friendly wave of a neighbor walking their dog. The fear was gone. Zion whistled low, a two-note signal, and Titan immediately dropped the toy, stood up, and trotted to his master's side, ready for the next command. Zion patted the dog's flank. "Time to go, buddy," he murmured. He walked up the porch steps, the new wood solid beneath his boots, to where Martha and Josie were waiting. Martha sat in her wheelchair, a blanket over her lap, looking at Zion with eyes that held a lifetime of wisdom. She didn't cry. She wasn't the type for tearful goodbyes. Instead, she reached out and took Zion's large, rough hand in her frail ones. "You fixed more than the house, Mr. Scott," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "You fixed the foundation of this family. We were sinking, and you pulled us up." Zion shook his head gently, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just hammered some nails, ma'am. You two did the hard part. You survived." Martha squeezed his hand. "Don't sell yourself short. The world needs men who build fences, not just men who tear them down. You go safely now." She released him, giving Titan a final scratch behind the ears, whispering a thank you to the silent guardian. Josie stood by the railing, twisting a dish rag in her hands, struggling to find the words. She had spent the last week watching this stranger work tirelessly for them, asking for nothing in return. He had saved her dignity in the diner, saved her home from the landlord, and saved her town from a tyrant. "I don't know how to pay you back," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The materials, your time, we don't have much." Zion stopped her with a raised hand. He reached into the pocket of his tactical pants and pulled out a small, heavy object. He took Josie's hand and pressed the object into her palm, closing her fingers over it. Josie opened her hand. Resting on her palm was a heavy brass coin, about the size of a silver dollar. On one side, it bore the intricate, embossed emblem of a Navy SEAL team, an eagle, a trident, an anchor, and a pistol. On the other side, a Latin inscription that translated to strength and honor. It was a challenge coin, a symbol of brotherhood, respect, and belonging. "You don't owe me anything," Zion said, his voice low and serious, looking her directly in the eyes. "This is a unit coin. We only give these to members of the team, people who have faced fire and didn't run. You stood up to them, Josie. You kept going when it was hard. That makes you one of us." He smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "If you ever feel scared or weak, you hold on to that, and remember that you have a brother out there who has your back." Josie clutched the coin to her chest, tears finally spilling over, but they were happy tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Zion." He nodded once, a sharp military acknowledgement. He didn't linger. Long goodbyes were not his style. He turned and walked down the steps, Titan falling into step beside his left leg. They moved with the same synchronized purpose as the day they arrived, a man and his beast, always moving forward. Zion threw his duffel bag into the bed of the truck and opened the passenger door for Titan, who leaped in effortlessly. Zion climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with a deep, throaty rumble that sounded like a beast waking up. He backed the massive black truck out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel. He paused for a moment at the street, looking back at the little white cottage with the marigolds in the window. Josie was standing on the porch, waving, the brass coin glinting in the sunlight. Martha raised a hand in farewell. Zion tapped the horn once, 2 short blasts, a final salute to the civilians he had served. Then he shifted gears and pulled away. The truck moved down the street, turning onto the main coastal road. The windows were down, and Zion rested his arm on the frame, feeling the cool ocean air rushing past. Titan stuck his head out into the wind, his tongue lolling, eyes squinting against the sun. As they picked up speed, the town of Port Haven began to blur in the rearview mirror. The diner, the docks, the mansion on the hill, they all faded into the distance. The road ahead was open, a ribbon of asphalt stretching along the cliffs, bordered by the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean on one side and the towering green forests on the other. Zion Scott was a soldier, a traveler, a shadow that moved between the light and the dark. He had brought the storm to the wicked and the sun to the righteous. And now his watch here was ended. But as the truck disappeared around the bend, vanishing into the brilliant morning light, the feeling he left behind remained, a steadfast, unshakable belief that as long as there were people like him, the world was a little less lonely, and justice was never truly out of reach. If this story of justice and redemption touched your heart, please share it with your friends and family. Let's spread the message that kindness is not weakness, and that evil only triumphs when good people do nothing. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that uplifts the soul. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He be your shield in times of trouble and your light in the darkness. May He grant you the strength of a warrior and the heart of a servant, just like Zion. If you believe that God is still watching over the innocent and that justice will always prevail, type Amen in the comments below. God bless you all, and thank you for watching.